So, hello, Peter, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your experiences and your recently released memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
You bet. First of all, Casey, thanks for having me on. And it's a pleasure to meet everybody in your audience. I'm Peter Young. I live just outside of Bozeman, Montana. So it is about mid March right now. It's covered with snow still. And I have 5 children. 3 of them still live with me at home. So I love being a single dad. And Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger is the second book that I have written. The first book was called The Blue Team. It's a novel about faith and basketball.
I hadn't really thought about there being a connection between sports and religion until I read your memoir, because you've had an entire career based around sports,
Mhm.
but you've also had a life of being a faith-based individual as well.
Yeah, so the kind of the premise behind my book, The Blue Team, is that the athlete's greatest adversary, the guy that he really has to conquer, is not for the basketball player, the guy trying to block his shot, or for the American football player, the guy trying to tackle him, or in baseball, the guy that's trying to strike you out. But it's your own mind. We are our own worst enemy, and so I believe there's a lot of parallels between Christian theology when you can apply it to sports. And the idea being, again, that, if you, let's say, are nervous to shoot that free throw to win the game, well, it's not the opposing team that's making you miss, it's your own mind. And so I feel like, as a faith-based person, when I rely on something greater than myself, for me, it's Jesus Christ, to put my identity in, well, I want to win every game, but it's not the end of the world. It's not my identity. So it frees me up to play more loose and more relaxed. And what I love about all these sports analogies is it can be applied to the butcher, the baker, or the banker, right? Not just for sports. It's true for all of us.
I really love that. And I think that through doing this podcast, I've had a lot of exposure to toxic religious environments that perhaps wouldn't endorse or encourage individuals to be involved in things like basketball teams or ESPN. And I think it was really refreshing for me to recognize that there are individuals who can practice their faith and enjoy those things in life as well. And so that was a nice part of your memoir, and I think that it was good for me personally to recognize that not all individuals involved in Christianity are going to be steered away from things that they enjoy doing. So could you let the listeners know about your work with ESPN and how sports really has played such a significant part in your life?
Well, so I grew up in New Jersey, and I was your typical gym rat. So I was the kid that was always in the gym. When in the summer, when other kids went to the Jersey Shore and got a tan, I was still white and pasty white because I was in the gym all the time. And I had 4 older brothers. They all played basketball. My dad played college basketball. Let's see, 2 of my brothers played college basketball. So from a very early age, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to play basketball. I wanted to be the next Larry Bird. It wasn't anywhere near as good as that. So that really just kind of dominated my life. And then when I got done playing, I got into coaching. And after that, I got into sports broadcasting. So I just have always loved athletics. And I worked for ESPN a little bit. I didn't work many years for ESPN, but I called college football and basketball games for ESPN. But I worked a lot of years for a company called OLN, the Outdoor Life Network, which became Versus. Now they're NBC Sports. So I did the Tour of Italy bike race. I did an adventure race in Morocco. I did rodeo and sailing and rock climbing. I did everything.
What would you say is the most exciting or wild broadcast you've ever done for any sport? What would you say is the one that always comes to your mind when you think about like adrenaline and excitement?
Okay, that's a good question. Because again, I covered so many different events and I've done so many different things. And listen, we all have really funny stories, right? But I could probably say the most exciting one is the Calgary Stampede. So maybe your audience knows that in Calgary, that's kind of the biggest rodeo, one of the biggest rodeos in North America. And so they have the rodeo during the day. So that would be bull riding and calf roping and steer wrestling and all that. And then at night, they have the chuck wagon races. So if you've ever seen the chuck wagon races, I think there's 3 or 4 teams, And each team, so you got a wagon, and then you have 6 horses attached to the wagon, and then you have outriders. So you've got like 24 some odd horses in the arena, and there's 25,000 fans there in the stadium. And where our perch was to be able to call the event, so we got our headphones on and we're watching this, they would come right beneath us, and it was like literally being able to watch and listen to a thunderstorm pass 20 feet away from you.
Wow.
And the crowd's going crazy. And then they would come back after the lap and they would finish the race right in front of me. And it was amazing to watch and be able to call those races. So much fun.
Oh my goodness. So you were one of those people that was like blah, 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 as the race goes round really
Yeah,
quickly.
yeah.
Oh my
You
goodness.
had to be able to think quick on your feet. Yes.
Like an auctioneer almost.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to jump ahead, Casey, I have to say this too, because we're going to kind of skip right ahead. But in my book, the cult leader is Uncle Robert, and Uncle Robert knew nothing about sports. Literally, he wouldn't know a basketball from a baseball. So the fact that over the years I made my living in sports, I love sports, I wrote about sports, drove him nuts. He hated the fact that I would teach our children discipline and good sportsmanship and respect for authority, et cetera, all these wonderful life lessons that I would be teaching them through sports, but he didn't understand it. So he just kind of was very dismissive of it. It was one day where our oldest son at the time was a senior in high school. And, he was like, should he go play basketball? And he was not the greatest. He'd be on the team, but he wouldn't play much. So I was like, well, should he have him do it? And at the time, my wife and I, Paige, we were talking to him. And it was mostly Paige talking to Uncle Robert, and I kind of heard from a few feet away. She said to him, we're trying to teach him these life lessons about discipline. And he almost just spat out the words, you teach him. Like he was so dismissive of it because he didn't understand it, and thus he couldn't control it.
And of course, wants to tell everybody that he knows everything that there is to know about everything.
Right.
So having another man, I imagine, present in his environment, having knowledge about stuff that he doesn't, I imagine that drove him crazy.
Yep. He did not like that. Yeah. And that came out later on, when I wrote my book, The Blue Team. So I wrote it before my wife at the time had left me. Things were already pretty bad at this time. And then I was kind of full on brainwashed. But I was still able to write the book and finish it, and thankfully not ruin it. I did go back a year or two later and kind of tweak it and try and pull out the influences of Uncle Robert. But after it came out, about let's say a year or two after it came out, he was so dismissive of it, and he said the only reason I wrote that book was to try and fool him and everyone else in the cult that I was a Christian. I was lying, and I was just going to try and fool them by writing this book. Unbelievable.
There's so many things to discuss around Uncle Robert's perception of Christianity. And I don't really even know how
Where to start.
yeah, exactly. So maybe we can go back to the beginning of this particular part of your life and allow the listeners some insight into your earlier experiences, which you detail so well in your memoir. It's so brilliantly written. I think you might be able to tell that this isn't the first thing you've published because it's so well done. But
Thank you.
what I was able to understand pretty quickly from the opening of your book is that the experiences detailed in the memoir are not about a group that you were born and raised in, but rather a group that you were introduced to a bit later in life. So could you set the scene for the listeners and tell them a little bit about what your life was like in your childhood growing up before you were introduced to Uncle Robert?
Sure. So let me just kind of start at 28 is when I met Paige. And again, that's not her real name, but we'll just go with that for right now. So that's when I met her. So, and I had lived a pretty good life up until that point. I was born in New Jersey, the youngest of 5 boys, wonderful Christian parents. We grew up in a small little church there in town and had friends. My mother, who hails from Scotland, all the Scots from her side of the family, settled in New Jersey. So we had all of these aunts and uncles and cousins, and we'd get together once or twice a year. So we had a large family. And then we had a large church following. And then I went to a public school, went to college, got a degree, played basketball, fairly normal, healthy life, I think you would say at that point. And then I moved to Idaho, which is way out west, so a long way away from New Jersey, and got my first full-time job in TV. So I was the sportscaster at the 6 and 10 o'clock news. And that's where I met Paige. Now, Paige's history was also fascinating because Uncle Robert met Paige's father, John, at a tiny seminary. I don't even know if it exists in Fresno, California. So they would have met even before Paige was born in, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s. So in other words, Paige's whole life, Uncle Robert, who's not related. So Paige and her family are from Vancouver, British Columbia. And Uncle Robert is this guy from Syria. Don't look anything like him. Paige and her family, they're all tall, very Nordic looking. Uncle Robert's got, olive complexion, black hair, he's short. But anyway, Paige's father, John, was a man that was probably ripe for somebody like Uncle Robert to come in and kind of just dominate his life, which is what he did. So from the seminary on, Uncle Robert was always there. He lived in Southern California. Paige and her parents lived in either interior BC or Idaho. But he would come and visit every now and then. Paige's parents would always talk to him on the phone. So again, Paige grew up, if she ever had a question, and by the way, questions that you would normally as a woman ask your mom or another woman, she would ask Uncle Robert these questions. I mean, very sensitive topics that a young woman should not be talking to another man about unless it's her husband. But Uncle Robert was always the go-to guy. So, if there was a question that Paige's parents couldn't answer, call Uncle Robert. So then when we met in Idaho in 1996, again, I was 28. I remember, try and set the scene. I'm a tall guy, I'm 6'5", but Paige was 6 foot with the most beautiful head of hair, long golden curls, and just a stunningly beautiful woman. So I remember being, again, single at 28 at the time, I would see her around town and I would tell my friends, oh, that's the blonde girl. That's the blonde girl. And so there was a guy at the gym named Gary. And I'm telling Gary, and I didn't even know her name. I'm like, this blonde girl. And Gary's like, oh, I know who that is. Gary knew who she was. And he says, well, that's Paige and her sister. That's, Rebecca. And but be careful, because you can tell I liked her. They've got this weird family guru. And I remember before I ever even met Paige, my future wife, I knew about Uncle Robert. He was the family guru. So then when I met her, like at a singles Bible study, right? I go to a singles Bible study, I turn the corner to go into the room, and there she is, the blonde gal. Before I even had met her, I knew who Uncle Robert was. I didn't know his name, but I knew about the family guru. And that's how it started.
It does not give off Christian vibes. It's not a word that I would associate with Christianity. Is that, am I wrong in that conception?
Well, here's what as I go back and I look back and ponder everything, again, hindsight's not always 20/20, but it can be. And so I believe that the Lord has given me wisdom. I asked for it, he's given it to me. So I've been able to kind of go through all this and process it, and he's given me the eyes to see. That is that, Uncle Robert, when we got together and we'd have these conferences, you just sit and listen to him talk for hours and hours and hours, but he would read from the Bible, right? So, it's not like he's, teaching us anything that's satanic or anything. He would read from the Bible. But the analogy I give is, okay, you hit a golf ball. Now, again, Uncle Robert was teeing up the right thing. He's reading from the Bible, so he's teeing up the right golf ball. But if you hit a golf ball this much, 100 yards down the fairway, it's going to be 100 feet to the left or 100 feet to the right. Well, he would put his spin on everything. And 5-10 years down the road, you're so far away from the gospel. You're like, how did we get here? You read the Bible, and then you got the gospel of Uncle Robert with all of his sayings, and they kind of sound good, but they're not biblical. And even if you had a very limited knowledge of the Bible, you would say, wait a minute, this is not healthy. This is wrong. But, I would say I was all in, literally brainwashed for 2.5, 3 years. It took a long time. I went along to get along. So when people ask, well, how did this happen? I said, well, my wife adored the guy, revered him, and I loved my wife, and I wanted to get along, and I wanted to have a happy marriage. And so I knew pretty early on, he's not going away. So I got to find out a way to get along with this guy, or else I'm not going to have a close relationship with my wife. So that's how I just kept, getting sucked in further and further.
I was enthralled in those first chapters of the book where you were talking about this beautiful woman and you were all shy and you didn't know how to approach her and you felt a certain way when you would see her because I think all of us have a little bit of that romantic inside of us and will he get the girl, won't he get the girl? So I was really really invested in those early chapters, and I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through those initial conversations that you were able to have with Paige.
Sure. Well, it's an amazing love story. Really, it is. It's a
It is.
wonderful love story. Um, I had dated girls in the past. I'd never been married or engaged or anything, but I had a couple long-term relationships. Um, and so I, knew what it felt like to be in love. I'd been in love before, knew what it felt like to date somebody. But I would say after about 10 days, maybe, I was 90% sure I wanted to marry this woman. I was absolutely in love with her. She was different than any other woman I'd ever met. And I remember before I went to Idaho to get this job, to start this new job, I prayed. I said, Lord, could you, in 2 years, because I had a 2-year contract, give me this wonderful job working on outdoor sports and be married to this beautiful, tall, blonde Christian woman. Well, check, check, check. It checked all the boxes. And so you might be asking, well, what was the other 10%? What was your hesitation in terms of wanting to marry Paige? And it was, I needed to meet her father and Uncle Robert because she talked about them all the time. All the time. So I knew if I marry this woman, these two people are going to be a large part of my life. So then I met Paige. It was in late October, and I just fell in love right away. And met her parents at Thanksgiving, so like month later. And her mother's very quiet. Her father, meant well, had a good heart. Odd. It was an odd first meeting, but I thought, well, this is okay. This will be fine.
It was an odd first meeting. I've just remembered the part of the book that made it a kind of a bit odd with that he
Yes.
told you that you can't stand up to use the toilet.
Yeah. Yeah. So picture this again, I'm just meeting these people and, I'm kind of auditioning for the son-in-law, right? And I love this woman and I'm there and I've probably only been there like an hour and I'm a little nervous. So I go down to the hall and I use the hall bathroom. And as soon as I open the door, he's right there standing in the hallway. And his hearing wasn't the greatest because he was a contractor, so always using power tools. So he stood really close. He said, yeah, in our household, the men sit down to pee. And then, okay, that's weird. But what really made it weird was Uncle Robert taught us that. And that's the first time I heard that phrase. And I couldn't tell you how many times I heard that over the next 20 years. Why are we doing this? Because Uncle Robert taught us.
You meet Paige's parents and things continue to go well, but there's always that sort of thing in the background of Uncle Robert. He's like, even though you don't initially meet him, he's always there. He's just always there.
Because she's always bringing him up. Now, when of course, one of the pivotal moments of this whole entire story, kind of the magic key that unlocks this mystery and why I named the book Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger, really is right off the bat. So I'll go ahead and tell your listeners briefly. I'm 6'5" to start. Uncle Robert's about 5'6", so he's a very short man. About a month before I met Paige, she'd never met me. She had a dream. Does the Lord speak to us in dreams? I don't know. He's God. I guess he can do it if he wants. But anyway, it was a very important dream to Paige. And in the dream, she's in a house and there's a tiger that is on the loose. And she knows that if the tiger finds her, it's going to kill her. And she's in the house with a boyfriend at the time named Chad and then her mother. And then the door opens and in comes a tall man. And the tall man is there to get rid of the tiger, but she can't see the face of the tall man. So the dream really bothered her. So she sent a letter to Uncle Robert, and then Uncle Robert sent this 23-page letter back to Paige. He wrote it I think on like a Wednesday, and I met her on Sunday. And I know all this because Paige kept the original letter and the envelope with the postmark. So I went back and looked up what days were these. So he wrote the letter Wednesday, sent it Friday. I met Paige Sunday for the first time, 1996. So I know all of this happened before Paige met me. So it wasn't until 20 years later, and I'm like, well, duh, she couldn't see the face of the tall man because she hadn't met me yet. And she described the tiger with all of these descriptions that would accurately describe how she felt about Uncle Robert. The tiger was very strong and knowledgeable and powerful, and et cetera, et cetera. And she didn't want to kill the tiger, only wanted to kind of know where it was. And then when the tall man enters the dream, comes to the front door, she hides, Paige does, and Chad, the boyfriend, disappears. So when Paige shows up to that Bible study the first time, she's alone. The next week she shows up, and I'm counting the minutes till the Bible study the next week. She shows up with Chad, the boyfriend. That's the last time either one of us ever saw the guy. So just like in the dream, in real life, when Chad met me at that singles Bible study, never saw him again. At the time, I didn't know that would be significant. But again, 20 years later, after Paige had left me and I found the original letter and read it over again, my jaw hit the floor. And so I read this letter. Paige had me read it. It was so important to her. She had me read it about a month after we met. And I'm like, okay, it's odd, strange, but she was so invested in it. And I wanted to support her. And I said, okay. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, wait, I'm tall and this guy's short. Why? And in the letter, Uncle Robert tried to claim the position of the tall man, tried to claim he was the tall man. And most importantly, in the letter, he convinced Paige she wasn't a Christian. So she believed him and thus became one of the first people that had to be saved again by Uncle Robert, because eventually we all were. So yeah, he was always in the background, always.
The other strange thing about Uncle Robert is that he doesn't live in the immediate vicinity. Right. And there's not like a traditional congregation or church house that you're going to on a regular basis. It's almost like he doesn't really have his own group of church goers. It's Paige and her family, and then him and his family.
And that leads to one of the questions, Casey, that I would get all the time after, I got out of it and was rescued, and I would explain this to them. Again, they were just trying to grasp all this because it is a crazy story. And they'd say, well, what about other people? Were there, the Swansons, the Andersons, the Smiths, the Jones? And I'd say, no, there really wasn't. Did he have a congregation? Not that I know of. He never had a job that I know of. So he had a couple buddies. That one guy was, brother Michael, who was kind of always there. And Michael, I don't really know if he had a job or not. But other than that, no, it was us. So Paige and her parents, one brother, and then me and my children, this guy Michael, and maybe another guy or two, but that's it. And and Paige had a very large family. She had aunts and uncles and cousins, and then she had 4 siblings. She was one of 5 as well. And they got all shunned, every one of them, except for the one brother. All of them, all because of Uncle Robert.
In your initial stages of your relationship with Paige, you meet her, she has a boyfriend, but you notice that they're not really physically intimate. They talk, but they don't seem like emotionally connected, maybe. And then eventually Paige comes and she's not with Chad. So you see your chance and you take it and you start dating and you quickly fall in love, and it's so romantic and just wonderful and lovely to read. And then you meet the parents and that kind of goes, pretty much okay. How long is it then before you are officially introduced to Uncle Robert?
Okay, so yeah, Paige and I meet in late October. I meet her parents in Thanksgiving, late November. And I don't meet Uncle Robert until Paige's older brother gets married in April. So that's about mid-April. And, she caught the whatever, I caught the garter. And, everybody kind of knew that, we were going to have another wedding here pretty soon. But there was a key moment in between. So again, I meet Paige in October. I don't meet Uncle Robert till April. In February, Paige flew up to Northern Idaho to do something for work. She stayed at her parents' house and Uncle Robert was there. she had been disturbed by this letter, the dream letter about the tiger this whole time. And so while there with Uncle Robert, he convinces her, yeah, that tiger is you. The tiger is you, Paige. You are not surrendered or saved. You are going to kill yourself, metaphorically speaking. You are not saved. You are not a Christian. And she had already been baptized. She had already professed her faith. She didn't need this guy to do this to her, but he convinced her. So then she came back. Like, I remember that vividly. She came back that day and we were at my apartment and she was all aglow, so excited. And yeah, I was just saved by Uncle Robert. Okay. It sounded odd, but I didn't want to say anything. And then I could just tell by the way she was looking at me. I said, "You don't think I'm saved either, do you?" And she said, "No." And I still hadn't even met Uncle Robert yet. And I remember at the time being disappointed, but I just knew she and I were destined to be with each other. And I thought, well, I can't go convince you, Casey, I'm a Christian, and you better believe me. That's silly. Nobody can do that. You show it by how you live your life. And so I thought, that's what I'll do. And apparently I did. And so then I met Uncle Robert at Paige's older brother's wedding in April. Again, odd, eccentric. I thought, I didn't spend a whole lot of one-on-one time with him. So I thought, okay, I'm fine. And then I knew, like on the plane ride home, I'm ready to ask her to marry me.
Do you know anything about Uncle Robert at this time? Who is he? Where did he come from? Like
Right.
it's so strange, and it's it's detailed in your writing so well how you were slowly brought into Uncle Robert's sphere of influence over time, and how your
Mhm.
mindset changed, not from your own volition, of course, but
Right.
through the coercion that you were placed under. It's so strange trying to piece together the earlier parts, the 60s and
Mhm.
70s, and Paige's father being caught in Uncle Robert's sphere of influence, because you're falling in love with a woman who is directly involved with him and has
Mhm.
been since she was born. So I understand that part of you moving into that space. But the other part of it is just it's strange, isn't it?
It is, again, so much of it I didn't see, right? I didn't meet Paige until, in 1996. She's in her mid 20s or early 20s. So I didn't know all of this background. So there's a couple moments that I can remember that were really telling, especially now, 25 years later. First one, Paige and I were there in Pocatello, Idaho, and I don't think I'd even met Uncle Robert yet. It might have been right before going to her brother's wedding. She was always talking about him, and I had said something to her about along the lines of, it's really kind of odd the way you and your sister talk about him. And Paige said, how can you say that? She was very delicate because she loved me as well, I think, at the time. But she was trying to delicately say, well, how could you say that about him because you've never met him? And then I said to her, I said, Paige, I'm not saying this about him. I'm saying this about you. It's not him, it's how you talk about him. I don't know anything about the guy. I don't remember her reaction, but it was she and her sister at the time. And of course, the irony is that in a few years, her sister came to understand who Robert was and despise him. And then at our wedding, Paige's real uncle, who actually unfortunately just passed away, he was in his late 70s. He just passed away about a month ago. But he did marry us, the real uncles. This is John's brother. And he said something along the lines of, Peter, over the years, us Clausens haven't gotten together much like this. This is kind of a rarity. And it was because John had really isolated his family away from everybody because of Uncle Robert. John's relationship with his parents, so this is Paige's grandparents, were always strained for decades because of Uncle Robert. So my kids represent the one, two, three, fourth generation that has been affected by this guy. So my kids' great grandparents, their grandparents, obviously their parents, and them. And so we got married and we initially moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I used to live. And then a year later, we moved back to Idaho. But Uncle Robert lived in Southern California. So for those first few years, it was heaven on earth. I mean, we didn't see him much. And I didn't, he didn't really control my thoughts, or he probably did with Paige, because she'd be talking to him on the phone a lot, probably more than I knew. But it wasn't really until it was two moments that really kind of put gasoline on the fire. It would be the birth of my second son and 9/11. So can I just go into those two stories?
Yeah, please do. I really loved hearing about the well, there are a lot of stories about the your children entering the world, and each of them is so like different in
Yeah.
their own way as well. And I really enjoyed getting the insight into those experiences. As somebody that has two young children myself, I do
Yeah.
appreciate a good birth story. So there were some interesting points in the book regarding that as well. So please do tell us. You got married and you did go on
Yep.
to have
Yep.
children.
Yep. Yeah. So we got married. And then, of course, 10 months later, whoa, this is what happens. We had our first son. And then about, let's say, 2 years later, we got pregnant again. And I had been on a sports broadcasting assignment. I think it was in Boston. And I flew in, and I would always, come home to Pocatello. We lived just south of Pocatello. And I, get in like on the red eye, and I'd get home at about midnight. And Paige, is pregnant. She kind of rolls her belly over and says she's leaking. And again, having never grown up with a sister, and my mother never talked about this kind of stuff. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? She was leaking amniotic fluid. So we went straight to the hospital, and they determined that, sure enough, she did have a leak. She was 26 weeks pregnant. So she had to stay on bed rest for the next 6 weeks. Our son, David, was born 32 weeks. So he's 8 weeks premature by C-section. Obviously, his lungs are severely underdeveloped. So he was in the ICU for about, he was in the ICU for 6 weeks, nearly died several occasions. So it was very difficult. I was at home with our oldest son while she was in the hospital. And so it's scary. And then immediately upon coming to the hospital, the doctors don't know why these things happen, right? They don't know why women start leaking amniotic fluid early, or why things happen with pregnancies. They do happen. But Paige knew. So what Paige came to believe was, just prior to this episode of going to the hospital, her sister Rebecca had said to Paige and her parents, listen, I don't think this Uncle Robert guy is who he says he is. I think he's a fraud. I think he's dangerous. I don't trust him. Just be careful. And that was
Yeah.
it. She didn't say, well, Paige had kind of accused Rebecca later on of saying certain things, but that's all Rebecca said. I don't trust the guy. I think he's bad for our family. I don't want anything to do with him. And I don't know if I even put this in the book, but at that moment, her mother was convinced, you're right. And then the father, I think, was partially convinced and was going to go
Oh,
over to confront Uncle Robert at that guy George's house. And the mother and the father, so my former in-laws, at that moment, after having talked with Rebecca, were like, yeah, you're right. And then, as soon as Uncle Robert, got John one-on-one, flipped a switch. So John was like, oh, my daughter's wrong. My daughter's wicked. And then Rebecca shows up to the house where there's all these adults, and she's this young, emotional girl. And that was it. So she gets viciously shunned by the family. But in conversations, Paige had believed Rebecca and said, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we need to be careful. And she supported her sister for a brief amount of time. And then she goes to the hospital. And so she became convinced, Paige did, that the Lord was punishing her and basically
oh,
threatening the life of our child, going to kill our son in the womb, because she did not stand up for Uncle Robert when Rebecca, her younger sister, defamed her. I remember, at the time, I thought, really? Because she told me this a few days after being in the hospital. She was in anguish and tears. She'd already talked to Uncle Robert on the phone, and he, of course, probably agreed with her,
that's
and
it.
well,
That's
yeah,
it, isn't
yeah,
it?
of course, yeah,
That's where the idea of that has come from. I was going to ask if they were in communication while she was in the
oh
hospital.
yeah,
So that answers that question, doesn't it? How did she arrive at that conclusion? Well, quite obviously from his
on the phone, always on the phone with him. And so then she told me, and again, I thought, really? That seems kind of odd. Okay. And she was clearly in anguish in a difficult moment. I didn't want to challenge her on it. At the time, I'm still kind of like, who is this guy? I mean, really? And you're going to treat your sister this way? So then that was when the family split. So, we did not see any of the aunts and uncles anymore. I still haven't seen the aunts and uncles and cousins since 2020. Haven't seen any of them. And then 3 of the siblings, all gone, all shunned. And then Lincoln was thankfully born, tiny little kiddo. He was over 4 pounds, so bigger than we thought. But I'll never forget when he was born. It's a difficult moment because your wife's there, and there's a sheet, so she can't see what's going on behind the sheet. So your wife is not in 2 pieces, but doesn't look good. She's on the table, and so your son comes out, and I went with him, and I had to leave my wife in the operating room. So then I follow into the ICU, and they put him on like this, almost looks like a little warming pad, basically, and he was struggling to breathe, and he's got the tiny little body, and his chest cavity and abdomen would literally go about that small, and then up on the breath, and that small. And so I'm right there, on my knees, talking to him, and yeah, tough moment, but Lord saved him, got him through it. And so then he got out of the hospital a couple weeks later, and he ended up being a Division I college athlete. Just he's now 6'5", a stud. But boy, it was scary. What a fascinating and scary start to his life.
Mm. And you're tall as well, so I imagine that your hands are quite big. And do you remember the first time holding him and how small he was to
He was,
hold?
yeah, because our first son and all the other children were very big babies, and he's, my hands aren't that big, and I've got a kind of a bent finger there, but he's fitting right in there. He's pretty small.
Oh gosh. Oh
So
my goodness.
yeah, and for me, I thought, well, this is a bonding moment between Paige and I, between my wife and I, where we can draw closer together. I didn't realize the magnitude of the influence Uncle Robert had on her in that moment. I read a letter she wrote. Literally, I found it on my computer or like on a CD. 18 years later, I'd never read it. And it was what Paige revealed to be her thoughts on that whole moment, and how she wrote how she was sinking into the abyss of death and hell, and she was giving up her life because she had not defended Uncle Robert. And the Lord was literally going to turn her back on her and kick her to the curb and send her to the pit of hell because she had not defended Uncle Robert. And again, at the time, I didn't know this. So what I thought was, we're going to get through this moment and we're going to be a team. And again, at the time, I thought I was the greatest husband on earth, the greatest father, and we may have had the greatest marriage, right? Little did I know that behind the scenes, it was unraveling, even at that point, and I didn't know it.
There's a really tender moment between you and your wife when she arrives home. You weren't expecting her to come home
Mm.
with your son from the hospital, and that was a really tender moment in the book. And I think that that is what makes the writing so compelling. You have this love story at the beginning, and
Yeah.
you have these real human moments are that are real, that people experience. These are things that people have felt. uh those moments where, when you describe what it felt like for Paige to come in for that hug that you have when
Yep.
she gets back from the hospital, it's those moments that are relatable for, I imagine, every reader, despite the experiences that you have later on as a result of Uncle Robert's influence. But what that does is allow people to recognize that this can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
This can happen to any single person. And it was tough getting through to the end of the book, because I just wanted to sit Paige down and say, "Come on, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I
You're not
recognize is
alone.
not it's not always the correct response, because we have to have compassion and sensitivity and understanding. But sometimes when you feel like they're not all parties are practicing those things,
Right.
that you're like, "Come on." So you are experiencing some difficult things as a partnership. Paige is going through these other things that you're not entirely aware of at that time. What is it that starts to change between Paige and Uncle Robert and between Paige and yourself as time goes on? Because it's almost like she's in a relationship with two people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a couple key moments. So, obviously, with the birth of my second son, David, at that point, it's very clear looking back that Paige is absolutely 100% totally devoted to him. And she would give up her life to protect Uncle Robert. Okay. And I probably didn't know that at the time, but clearly looking back, I can see that was the case. So then what happens about a year later is we all remember 9/11. And I remember where I was during 9/11. I had, because I grew up in New Jersey, I had, well, a high school classmate who was widowed on that day. I had classmates in the buildings that got out. So I obviously have strong feelings about 9/11. So a couple months later, maybe about a year later, we're there with Uncle Robert again at another conference. And he's talking about 9/11. Somehow it came up and he said, 80,000 people died on that day. And I thought, well, I've heard a death toll around 3,000. And somehow it got on to politicians. And he just, in a very dark, menacing way, Truman was a Jew, as in President Harry S. Truman, and Roosevelt, as in FDR, was a Jew. And just the way he kind of spat it out with such venom. And I was shocked. I didn't say anything to him at that moment, but I remember that living room, I was stunned. And here's this guy that my wife reveres. And I'm like, so that night, we're downstairs, the kids are asleep. I'm like, honey, here's what this guy said. I don't think we should have anything to do with him. And she had a very concerned look on her face, didn't say much, and probably just left and went to go brush her teeth or something. And I didn't follow up. I didn't say, wait a minute, are you comfortable with this guy, with what he feels? Obviously, she was. And she didn't probably want to have this kind of showdown at the moment. And I look back, I think, well, what would have happened if I had pressed the issue, if I had continued and said, wait a minute, hey, while he leaves, John and Christine, Michelle's parents, Paige's parents, what do you think, about this guy and all his thoughts? And, they probably would have ganged up on me at the time. So then at that moment, I thought, wow, what have I gotten myself into with this guy? I never doubted my relationship with Paige, never doubted my marriage to her at all, like literally ever. Never. Not even this moment do I doubt that it was the right thing. But then the conferences started. So we would go to Northern Idaho and have conferences where it'd be my family, Uncle Robert, Paige's parents, and we would literally just sit and listen to this guy talk for hours. Some of it was just crazy off the wall. Some of it was borderline brilliant. Some of it was really good. A lot of it was odd, and it was all really directed on him. And so it was very slow, Keith. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it was a very slow progression to where I realized he was more of an influence in her life than I originally thought, if that's even possible, but he was. And slowly but surely, as I would spend, more time with Paige and her family than with all of my extended young family who lived far away, it was just so much more immersion into the world of Uncle Robert. So where there was some things I thought, well, yeah, this guy's brilliant. I totally agree with him on this point and on that point. But then, over here, I'm going to try to forget about that. And it was a very slow progression until I realized that all these years, after being married 17 years, would that be 17 or 16 years? 17, that Paige still didn't think I was a Christian. And so we went to one of our conferences. And at the conferences, he would kind of set the agenda, which was basically, I talk, you listen. But beyond that, it was, here's what I'm going to talk about. And on this one conference in 2015, everybody was to give their testimony of how they became a Christian. And, at the end of the couple of days there, I realized that, most of the adults there would tie it all back to him. And I was the outlier. I was the only one that wouldn't tie my faith journey back to him. It wouldn't begin with him, but with everybody else it did. And Paige wasn't buying it. She just didn't believe me. And so after 17 years of marriage, 17 years of trying to have my wife love and adore and revere me, her husband, like she did another man, and constantly hearing about how brilliant this other man is, I finally just caved. And I look back at that moment when I caved. And I said, I must not be a Christian, and there were tears for both of us. And I remember we went inside, we were going to tell Uncle Robert, and oh, wow, this is going to be great. And in that moment, what was going through my mind was, well, maybe this will be finally the key that allows our marriage to be the way I've always hoped it would be, to where she would truly, truly love me and revere and honor me and not another man. It wasn't like, well, I'm finally going to be a Christian now. No, that really never entered my mind, as odd as that sounds. It was, okay, now I guess I've finally joined the right way, and I'll have the marriage I've always wanted.
Robert didn't explicitly tell each of you that you couldn't attend traditional church. So there were times where you and Paige would go to different churches to practice your faith in the more traditional sense of being part of a congregation, as opposed to sitting in somebody's living room and listening to Uncle Robert. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that looked like and how that changed as well.
So let's say when Paige and I got married, we first lived in Boulder, Colorado. So we went to a Presbyterian church, very large church, left after a year. And then we moved back to Pocatello, lived in a tiny town called Ingham, but I'll just call it Pocatello. And we went to a very traditional Presbyterian church. This is Idaho, and it's Mormon country as well. So it would be, fairly conservative. And it was a small congregation, many older people. And that's what I was used to. And was the pastor brilliant? Did I agree with everything? No. He's a nice man. He tried. So then we switched from that church to a smaller church, but a very similar feel. It wasn't any particular denomination or anything, just a small church. Again, pastor was a good guy. But, was he a dynamic leader? Nah, probably not. But again, when I go to a church, the leader's not the pastor. The leader's Jesus Christ. If you think the pastor's the leader, you got a problem. So then, in all of these churches, the pastor just never stood a chance because, Paige would then relay everything to Uncle Robert, and Uncle Robert would say, well, here's why the guy's wrong. And then Paige would relay that back to me. And I'd be like, well, we might not all agree on everything, but that's part of the process of being believers and humans, is that if we disagree, well, now the Lord is kind of forcing us to try and get along, right? Work it out amongst yourselves, kids, right? So then we moved and then to another small town about 2 hours north, and we joined a tiny little Baptist church, which is not your typical like Southern Baptist, but a little Baptist church, very small. Again, there was an elder pastor, was a wonderful man. I think Paige kind of liked him a little bit. And then, but he was interim. And then we had a full-time pastor, and this poor kid, just fresh out of seminary. And Paige just did not have any respect for this poor kid. And he was in over his head. And, again, so now what I'm telling you is a progression of, let's say, maybe 10, 12 years. We've left all these churches. And so I get the feeling like, Paige did not want to set foot in this church again because of what this young pastor had done, which it wasn't egregious, but, again, he was a little wet behind the ears. So I look around the West for preterist churches, which is basically a way of saying, that eschatology has been fulfilled already. And there was like two, one in Montana, one in Northern Idaho. And so we checked out the one in Montana. We just showed up one day. And I fell in love with it because, politically and theologically, we were a match. And there were a couple families, they all homeschooled and they worked together, and they were hardworking men. And after every service, we'd get together, we'd eat, and we'd talk. And what do you think about this? I disagree. Really? You disagree? Why? Okay, that's okay. We can still be friends, And I was gung-ho. I thought, this is great. I finally found a church home. And I was hoping and praying that Paige would feel the same way. So after going there for probably a few months, Paige's parents came down. And they didn't come down to attend church with us and hang out and make friends. They came down to interrogate everybody. It's pretty obvious. So they initially focused right on the kind of the patriarch of the church and just grilled him with questions over and over and over again. And then, of course, immediately, I think we were there one night or two nights. Maybe they stayed with us. I'm sure on the drive home, they were calling Uncle Robert. Yeah. And, well, here's what the guy said. Oh, well, here's where they're wrong, this, and this. And then we had an election sermon in Montana, maybe a couple of months later, where right before the state legislature is sworn in early January, we got to go to the state capitol building in Helena, and we basically had like a little mini sermon, and then had like a little conference afterwards. And I invited Paige's parents and Uncle Robert to show up, and they did. And it wasn't oil and water from the get-go, but it soon got there. And of course, Uncle Robert picked apart everything about these people because he had to. Because if Paige and I are looking to other people for answers or support or fellowship and theological questions that we need answers to, well, if we're doing that, then it's a threat to his rule, to his reign, to his dominion and dominance over us. So of course he had to squash it, which he did. Paige and our children came to despise the church, despise the people there. And in fairness to my children, they did that because that's what their mom and grandparents, maybe I didn't tell them outright, but they could tell. So we stopped going. We stopped going to that church, and that was it. It's the last church we ever went to.
After you stop attending church, Uncle Robert has some type of revelation where he believes he's figured out what America's true churches really are. And it was just, I never would have, if somebody would have said, like, put money on what you think that is, and
Yeah,
I realize the irony in what I'm saying,
right.
I never would have been able to guess. So I wondered if you
Yeah.
could just let us know about that little nugget of gold that Uncle Robert dropped on everybody.
Well, before I drop it on you, what's funny, there's a lot of funny things about it, and odd and sad and crazy, is that I had been around this idea for so many years that when I told, I think it was one of my sister-in-laws, who I had been talking to for a while, this is after everything, broke, my Paige had left me. She said, "What?" I said, "You didn't know that? I hadn't told you that?" She said, "No." So it was Paige's parents would go down to Southern California. They taught. So in the summer, they had time off, and they would go spend time sitting at the foot, of the master and soaking in everything Uncle Robert had to teach them. And I always knew what they talked about, because as soon as John and Chris would come and then stay with us in Idaho on their way home, that's all they could talk about, was everything that Uncle Robert had been drumming into their heads. So again, there's another one of those moments where John is standing really close, and he said, casinos are the true churches in America. I'll say that again, just in case you thought I had misspoken. Casinos are the true churches in America. And all the churches that everybody goes to on Sundays, those are absolutely worthless. You're wasting your time. Casinos are the true churches in America. And he said it with such conviction. I thought, Peter, be careful. Don't say anything. Don't get yourself in trouble. Don't ask too many questions, because you're not going to change his mind. I said, okay, interesting. And then as he described it, he said, well, anybody can go into a casino, regardless of your race, religion, creed, your bank account, your success in life, and be blessed by the Lord. Okay. But when I go into a casino, and I don't go in there much, I think I've been in a few times that, played blackjack, whatever. I see people worshiping money. I see desperation. I see people that are down on their luck, and they're being duped into thinking that this is going to save them economically, that this is how they're going to make a living, that they have barely enough money to pay their rent or whatever it is, and they go gamble. And listen, the house always wins. You and I know that. Everybody knows that. The house always wins. They give you free drinks at a casino because they always win, right? So you can go to a casino and have fun. That's fine. Go ahead and have fun. And you can win some money. But really, casinos are the true churches in America? I tried to keep my thoughts on that one to myself, because I knew that if Uncle Robert said it, Paige was going to believe it, and she did. And then they also called it, so in addition to it being a church, which I saw people worshiping money, they also called it the office. And I think this maybe sprung out of a desire to not let all of our young kids at the time know where they were going. So where Paige's parents live, there is an Indian casino, 45 minutes away, hour away. And they would go there all the time. So we'd have our conferences, and the adults would go to the office every night. And they knew I didn't want to go, so I stayed at home to watch the kids. And they would go to the office. And they literally would call it the casino their office, which again makes sense, because I never saw Uncle Robert work. I never saw him or heard him talk about a job. He never had a job, never had gainful employment that I know of. His wife did. His wife had a good job. She paid all the bills. So for him to go and gamble at a casino and call it his office, it, as crazy as it sounds, it kind of makes sense. Um, but that's just one other bizarre twist to all of this.
Sorry.
It's okay.
When you realize that Paige's father has met this con artist at a vulnerable time in his life, and that person has perhaps used Paige's father's faith and weaponized it in order to manipulate him and subsequently his entire family to come. It does also make sense that a con artist might spin things in their favor so to convince everyone this is the true church. I need you to fund my time in this true church so that I can continue giving you the theocratic information that you need, the answers to questions that you have, the guidance that you require from me after he has cultivated that dependency over all of those years. Um, it's a very clever thing, really, to convince everybody that that's the case.
So over the years, we would tithe to Uncle Robert. Now, when I say we, I say Paige and I. So when we first, got married, we probably would send him a bit of money every now and then. But I would also tithe to, let's say, our local church or to other organizations. There's one called Prison Fellowship where they take the gospel into prisons. I've always wanted to support them and other groups like that. And then over the years, that percentage that went to Uncle Robert was like this, and it got more and more until eventually we sent all of our tithe money to him. Paige's parents sent all their tithe money to Uncle Robert, and I would imagine Paige's older brother, who had a good job, sent all of his tithe money to Uncle Robert. And then Uncle Robert, whenever he would go on his trip, so he would go to DC, and supposedly he would go meet with congressmen, senators, and representatives, and share his wisdom of what is going to save the world from nuclear annihilation and what is going to save the world from international communism, and we'll get into that later, what that specifically was. But whenever he would go on these trips, he would stop by casinos along the way. And again, in America, most of the casinos are either in Vegas or like it's Atlantic City, New Jersey, or they're on Indian reservations where they're allowed to have them. So he would stop by all these places and he would gamble. Now, again, it's very slow and subtle how all of this happens. We're talking a 20-year time period. But I remember talking to a good friend of mine from college, explaining all this, and we had many conversations, after the fact. And she said to me, "Wait a minute, Peter, you guys all sent your tithe money to this guy, and he gambled all the time." And there was a pause on the phone, and I said, "Ooh, when you say it like that, it doesn't sound good, does it?" And I can look back at it now and kind of, it's kind of like gallows humor, laugh about it. But at the time, it was serious. I mean, this is his office. We have to fund Uncle Robert's ministry. And Uncle Robert is going to go talk with senators and representatives. And before the Gulf War, he wrote a letter to Saddam Hussein, and he's trying to intervene on the world stage. And I didn't buy all of it, but I thought, well, maybe this guy maybe he is meeting with all these senators. Maybe he is a first name basis with all these people. And then it was my lawyer, finally after the fact was like, "Peter, did you ever see him meet any of these people?" Like, "Well, no, I didn't." And, I was always uncomfortable if somebody would ever say, "Well, this guy was a con artist." But now, after all these years later, it's a good description. It fits.
Were your family ever aware of the situation around Uncle Robert? Not necessarily the difficulties that you and Paige were experiencing, because I know you were very private about those as you were kind of going through the motions of separation. But your family, your parents, they would come and help when there was a newborn, if there were periods where there were hospital stays. Your parents were present. So I wondered how aware they were of this kind of figurehead in the other family.
Well, good question. So I think when we got married, obviously all my family was there, and most of the Clauses were as well, because the breakup hadn't happened. So they, Uncle Robert spoke at our wedding. Now it was Paige's real uncle that married us, but Uncle Robert spoke, gave a little homily. And I learned after the fact, again, when Paige left me, is many years later, that one of my brothers and his wife almost walked out of the ceremony because of what he said. I can't remember what he said, but even back then, they knew how weird this guy was. So my parents and my brothers and sisters-in-law all would have known of Uncle Robert. They wouldn't have known hardly anything about his theology. They just would have known of him. They would have known that I now believed in preterism and past fulfillment, which is, again, to me, that's not a salvation issue. That's an issue where we as Christians could sit down over a cup of coffee and, okay, tell me your Bible verses to support it, and I'll tell you mine. We'll have good talk, and we're still friends afterwards. So they knew that. But beyond that, they probably didn't know much of anything else. So thus, all of these wild, revelations come out. So when Paige left me, it was January 14th, 2017, she basically told me in a letter, don't tell anybody. Don't tell your parents till we can talk to the kids. Don't tell the school or anybody in the community, because the two older boys are still going to high school. And, and I'm terrified of her and Uncle Robert. I've been totally emasculated and dominated by these two because I'm trying to save my marriage. And so then I obeyed her to as best I could. Didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my family that she had left, taken the three youngest kids, and was now calling me the devil, by the way, until 4 months afterwards that she had left. And so nobody in my family knew. And so I called him. I called all my brothers on the phone to call my parents. And they didn't know. I think my dad certainly had an inkling that it all went back to this Uncle Robert guy. And I know he did. I know he had an inkling. But then what really kind of got the spigot wide open on all the evidence, let's say, was that I would get an email from Paige or Uncle Robert, and I would just get sent to a tailspin. Now, again, at this time, I'd lost 30 pounds. I couldn't sleep. I was never suicidal, but I was an hour away from maybe checking myself into the hospital. I was a wreck. And I'm trying to still be a dad to the two older boys, who one's in college, one's in high school, and never let them see me cry, just try and maintain a good face all this. And they weren't talking to me at all because they believed their mom 100%. So then I would get these emails and I would just be, a wreck. And so then I would start sharing them with my lawyers, with my brothers, with another friend. And they would get these letters, these emails from Paige and Uncle Robert. And of course, they saw right away, immediately, this is a problem. And I'm like, really? Oh, well, that's a problem. Oh, yeah, Peter, that's a problem. So they saw it right away. And they then intervened. And I have a loving family. Are we perfect? No. But, one of the brothers flew out right away, like maybe a week after I called him. He flew out. Another brother flew out a couple months later to spend about a week with me. Yeah. So again, they all found out real quickly just how bad it was. And they didn't know. They knew there was this weird guy, but they didn't know the extent of it. Nobody did.
It's interesting that there was only one of Paige's siblings who wasn't shunned. And that person in your memoir has a very distinct presence and personality. But he's also male, so I wonder if that played into it a bit as well. But could you just tell the listeners a little bit about what Jack was like around Uncle Robert and his role in sort of supervising private one-to-one meetings between you and your wife? He was always with her, accompanying her. It was very strange.
And I apologize, Casey, but because in the book, I changed everybody's names, to kind of protect their privacy. So are you talking about Paige's older brother or her father?
Paige's older brother, Jack.
Okay, yeah. Well, so he was the one, other than Paige, that still revered and followed Uncle Robert. I don't recall him ever doubting it. I don't think he believed Rebecca at all when she had her revelation that, this guy is something we shouldn't follow. So he was always there. He would film all of our conferences. So he was kind of the technical guy that would film everything. And at the time, he also had a very difficult marriage that eventually broke up, and had a lot of issues, during that marriage. And his ex-wife never bought into Uncle Robert. So I'm sure there was a lot of tension in their household. She did not want anything to do with him. And that was
It's
pretty
funny
awkward. So,
how the marriages have problems when the spouses don't
oh
fully
my
buy
gosh.
into Uncle
Yeah.
Robert's teachings.
Well, and Uncle Robert's control was partly through guilt and shame. And would he control Paige through guilt and shame? Yes, but his guilt and shame was very effective when it came with the men, right? So, Uncle Robert, of course, has done everything perfect. He's only sinned once in his life. And Paige's father and older brother and I, we're not perfect. We've had some, let's say, a little bit of checkered past. And he was able to really manipulate that well, along with, discussions around the Bible, to then just heap the shame on us, like how worthless we are, and then also elevate him. Well, I've done everything perfectly. I've done it all perfectly. And if you read the story of Adam and Eve and everything that went wrong with human race, I've done it perfectly. But, you guys, clearly, he wouldn't come right out and say it, but it was implied. And I remember sitting in some of these conferences thinking, oh, my Paige must just think I'm the worst human ever. And there were many occasions where Paige's father would, be in tears over, being in the presence of the brilliance and the perfection of Uncle Robert, and it would magnify all of the things that he did wrong in his life. And it was awful. Put it bluntly.
Has to have a significant effect on you if you're seeing your father, one of your primary caregivers, reacting to a man in that way, presenting himself in that way. There are parts where Paige's brother Jack would be on his knees and, really revering Uncle Robert by his feet. But there's a very strange part in the book, and I wonder if this is why Paige's sister was shunned and why Jack wasn't, and why Paige was kept so closely at Uncle Robert's side. And that's the part where it's suggested to Paige that she tie the two families together. Do you think that that was Uncle Robert's intentions from the get-go? And could you just talk us through that particular part of your experience?
Yeah. Well, it was Paige's father that was the one that was on his knees in front of Uncle Robert. I remember that specifically. It was at one of the conferences, and he was sitting right next to me. I think it might have actually been the conference where we shared all of our testimonies. And he was reading from his notes, and he was so distraught. He starts, crying and sobbing. He gets up, walks across the living room, and gets on his knees and puts his hand on Uncle Robert's hands, and Uncle Robert just sits there and soaks it in. And most of the people would say, "Listen, thank you, but I'm not your savior. I didn't do anything. I might have helped you along the way." Oh, Uncle Robert soaked it in, and Paige's father just cried these tears of anguish, and I was uncomfortable. Oh, I thought it was so awkward. So then, when Paige came to me and said that she wanted to be a surrogate so that Uncle Robert could have a biological male grandson. Again, I was stunned, I was angry, terrified that she might actually go through with it. I don't think it was Uncle Robert's idea, and I don't think it was her father's idea. Clearly, they loved it. I don't know if her parents ever knew. Uncle Robert certainly knew. She told me first, then she told Uncle Robert. Paige did. Uncle Robert was, of course, thought it was great. But Paige, because to her credit, needed my buy-in, and I did not want to buy in at all. So what happened was Uncle Robert had two boys, and they got married, but they had daughters, or they had adopted boys, so they didn't have a male to carry on Uncle Robert's precious bloodline. And so Paige saw this as something that needed to be rectified. And at the time, she's, I think, 40, 41 maybe. And the last thing I wanted to do was have our families tied to this guy. So she was going to have be a surrogate for the older of Uncle Robert's two boys, and who I'd met once. We'd never met his wife ever. So, who knows if the guy would even want to go along with this. But Paige was absolutely determined that this is something that she should do. So I do think it was her idea. But again, when I say it was her idea, well, how many of her ideas really spring from a soil that's independent from Uncle Robert? Probably none. they all come from, they all find their root, let's say, in the teachings of Uncle Robert. So even though it was her idea, it's because all of her ideas have been incubated in a world that's run by Uncle Robert.
And at this point, Paige is at a certain age where it could be very dangerous for her to have another child.
You would think. So what I did is I started doing a bit of research and, going online, is there ways that, she's not even allowed to do this? Is it legal to, try and do this at a certain age? I think in California it was illegal. And then I started to try and think of all of these logistical reasons that we should not do this. And I remember asking her, I said, are you going to have sex with this guy? She said, no, we would do it in vitro. Okay. Well, what if you have a daughter? Would you do it again? Yes. What if you had 5 daughters? Would you do it a 6th time? Yes. But don't worry, Peter, the Lord will provide. Okay. And what makes the story even more poignant, at least for me, and harder to deal with, was we had 5 kids at the time, and we had talked about having a 6th. We were going to name him Matthew. We'd already named him, and that's what we were going to have. And it wasn't like, we were really planning for it, but it was something that got bantered back and forth between she and I. And clearly she was having reservations about having another child with me because I was too immature. So then she said to me, after she had told me that she wanted to have this surrogate for Uncle Robert to have a male bloodline continue, she said, I will not have Matthew with you until we at least offer this to Uncle Robert and his son. Otherwise, we're not having Matthew. And I remember being stunned by that, and told it to Uncle Robert. And again, the irony of ironies is that in the end, it was Uncle Robert who said, and Paige took a vow. She said, I took a vow before the Lord that we will not have another child together until I get to do this for Uncle Robert. So there was Uncle Robert that said, well, Paige, as a wife, you shouldn't have done that. And so Paige didn't go through with it, not because of anything I felt or said or did. It was because Uncle Robert told her not to do it. So the idea kind of went away, and we never had Matthew. And the idea of having a surrogate did come up one other time about a year later. And that was after the conference where I was supposedly saved by Uncle Robert, where I was, just beaten down by him, finally caved. And then like later that day, I'm like, really? Like I was never a Christian my whole life. Like I'm almost 50 and I've believed in the Lord my whole life. Like, really? Okay. So then a couple of weeks later told Paige, I said, listen, if you really want to go through this and have a child be a surrogate, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. And she was like, well, I'm not going to do it unless you're fully on board. Well, that's not happening. And so it went away. But at that point, the closest in our marriage, it was downhill, and it kept going downhill.
So you having this experience or making an admission that you have been saved or born again, or Uncle Robert has helped you realize that you were, one way and now you're a different way. It felt in the moment like it might fix some things,
yeah,
but it didn't heal any of those wounds that had started to appear in your marriage.
No. So again, in that moment, in that conference, everybody had given their testimony. I gave mine. Paige didn't buy it. And the testimony I gave was totally tailored to try and convince Uncle Robert and Paige and her parents to, to back off and just let them believe I was a Christian. It had nothing to do with my testimony, really. So Paige didn't buy it. And so then, I get convinced I'm not a Christian, although I immediately had doubts, like, really? And I wrote a letter and sent it to my parents and my brothers. And I'm sure they probably rolled their eyes like, oh boy. And so that would have been in 2015. And yeah, I guess Paige maybe just never believed it. And so the next year we had a conference again in June 2016, and we bring it up all over again. And Paige doesn't believe it. And so if Paige doesn't believe it, of course, Uncle Robert is going to defend Paige, because they are one. They're always on the same page. They're always, thinking the same thing. Oh, well, you must not be. And so, really? Oh my gosh. And we end that conference, and I'm just I'm beaten down. Like, what do I have to do? And I just feel like my marriage is slipping away. My life is slipping away. What is going on? And even then, though, when I say marriage slipping away, I never in a million years thought she would leave. Ever, ever. I thought maybe this will just be, we won't be very close, but she'll never leave. So then a few months later, we had what I describe in the book as the Butte ambush. So Butte, you have to get a little background to Butte. Butte, they sometimes call it Butte, America, because you had all these immigrants pouring into Butte in the late 1800s because they had discovered, gold, silver, and mostly copper. And so Butte has this wild, ribald history. A lot of Irish there. And again, it kind of still has this, very frontier Western feel to it. So we meet at this dumpy, miserable, flea-bitten hotel because Uncle Robert and Brother Michael are driving through, going somewhere, who knows where. So Paige's parents come in, Paige and I drive over, and we meet there in this dingy, dark little cave. And it's like a torture chamber because Paige starts out, Uncle Robert's in the front of the room. Paige says, yeah, I don't think Peter's a believer. Okay, here we go. And so for the next hour or so, Uncle Robert's asking me questions of what I had done in my life, the things that I had done wrong, the sins that I have committed. I was completely faithful in my marriage, literally never even thought about having an affair. I love my wife, which was something that some of the other men in that room could not say. But as a college guy, I sowed my oats. We'll say that. That's all I'll say. So I didn't have a perfect life. Nobody has. So we're dredging all of this up. So about an hour in, I'm as worthless as the dust on the carpet on this filthy room. And I know it's coming. I know it has to happen. I know it. I'm just waiting for him to get there. And finally, as I'm, in tears, and all the other people in the room are just sitting there quietly listening. No one's defending me. No one's standing up saying, wait, come on. Nope, they all know where it's headed. So finally, yep, I guess I must have lied to you guys last year. Didn't really do it. Not a Christian, not saved. So we go through the motions again. And now Peter's finally saved. And that's like an hour in. And at one point, though, while he's still berating me, while he's still beating me into a pulp, he says, I would crawl on my hands and knees 1,000 miles to be with Paige. An odd thing to say for a married man, don't you think? But in that room, none of us thought it was odd. And it was just another example of, well, Uncle Robert's brilliant, and Uncle Robert is so compassionate. And Uncle Robert would have said that to Paige's dad, and he would have, I would walk 1,000 miles on my hands and knees to be, with your wife, Kathy, and nobody would have thought it was odd, because if it was odd for anybody else, it was never odd for him. So he says, if you want to leave, leave now. And he points to the door. If you want to leave, go ahead and leave. And I remember thinking it was such a bizarre comment. I'm not going to leave. And I look back at it now like, who the hell are you to tell me that? But everybody in the room was waiting for my answer. So I had to say, no, I don't want to leave. So then we prayed and I became a Christian, I guess, finally. And the attitude of everybody in the room was kind of like a year before, it was with tears of joy. Well, Peter finally sees it. Uncle Robert's finally saved him. He finally got it after resisting all these years. Now it's kind of like, oh, geez, he pulled a fast one on us. Is it for real this time? There was certainly less joy in the room, which again, the Christian life, the Christian faith is all about joy, and we are joyful when we know that we're a child of God, right? Like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And well, where was the joy in that room in Butte? Wasn't there. It wasn't there. And it was sick because everybody in that room was sick, including me. We were sick in the mind.
You'd really tried to buy into the Uncle Robert way of life at this point. You were realizing that everybody else was spending, an hour to 2 hours a day on the phone with this man, because at this point, you yourself, if you're having problems with Paige or issues with communication, or Paige's parents show up out of nowhere to kind of like, interrogate you or see what's going on, you phone Uncle Robert for advice,
Yep.
because at that point you're in that self-sealing system.
Yep.
How can I save my marriage? By accepting Uncle Robert. What does that mean? That means he dictates all of our decisions. He is
Everything.
aware of everybody's thoughts and feelings all of the time. And you really give the reader some insight into what's expected of you if you are to fully comply with that way of life. But that's still not enough. I feel as if Uncle Robert's agenda the entire time was to convince Paige that she should not be married to you.
Well, that's the $1 million question. Was this in the agenda of Uncle Robert all the time? And I still don't know the answer to that. Obviously, that's where it went. Um, and so, would Uncle Robert still have had his control and dominion if Paige were still married to me? Well, not if I kept asking questions. It wasn't so much that Uncle Robert, I don't think, set out to destroy our marriage, but he couldn't have me around if I was going to keep questioning him. So even in, let's say, the 2.5 to 3 years that I was fully bought in, I still was never fully comfortable around him. I still thought, okay, he's Uncle Robert, he's brilliant, I believe you, but I don't understand this. And so then I would ask questions. And it's like, well, Peter, quit asking these questions. If you don't understand it, that's just because you're dumb. Just trust Uncle Robert. And so a few weeks after that Butte ambush, Paige didn't believe me. She just thought, no, you've been a zombie these last few weeks. And she didn't believe it. She thought it was a fake and a fraud. Didn't believe it. I thought, well, what do I got to do? So I did it, I think, 5 times with this guy. And of course, now I look back and think, what a just an abomination. And it was, mental and emotional and spiritual abuse.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And the situation that you've already explored with us in regards to Paige coming to you, saying she wants to separate, telling you that you shouldn't talk to anyone about it, don't tell the kids until the kids ask you outright what's happened. And then when they do ask you, we will sit down together and have that conversation with our children. You
Right.
go months in this isolated space on your own, calling Uncle Robert for advice and help. And he's basically just like, well, we've dealt with you now. Now that Paige is separated from you, I don't want you to call me anymore. I don't want to hear from you anymore. But then positions it like it's your problem. You should be over this by now. You shouldn't be as stressed about this as you are. Why are you phoning me upset about this? It's happened now. You just deal with it, which is absurd in its own sort of thing. But then those conversations with your children happen without you there anyway, even though you've gone through months of this kind of lonely turmoil. That was one of the hardest parts of the book, I think. It was extremely frustrating to watch your kind of descent into the realm of Uncle Robert. But then when you were just left, that was so tough because you were shunned without really understanding why. There,
Yeah.
when Paige's sister was shunned, it's because she questioned Uncle Robert. She came out and said, I don't believe this guy. With you, it was you were just left like, I've done everything. I've done everything you asked me to. It was really, really tough.
Yeah, I had tried everything that I could think of to try and save the marriage. And so then when she left, she had said, don't tell the kids, we'll tell them together. And in the book, I really struggled with trying to protect, the privacy of my kids. Of course, I changed all their names. Trust me when I say I left a lot out of the book when it came to what happened to the kids. A lot. So the 2 older boys were still living with me at the time, Thomas and David. And I'm sure at that point they kind of knew something's up. Dad's kind of acting weird. The 3 younger ones had no idea. No idea. The day she left was just another day. They barely remember it. Because Paige told the kids about a month later what had happened. And I wasn't there. She told them up in Idaho. So then when she came back, I think it was for my birthday, she would come back like once every 3 weeks or a month. And then the kids knew, and of course I could tell right away, the kids are looking at me differently. The 2 older boys knew as well. So then, she leaves mid-January. By mid-March, it's still somewhat civil. Nobody knows what's going on, but it has not devolved to the point of I'm the devil. It got there quick. So when the kids came back, the 3 younger children, and they were here for a couple of days, I took them aside one-on-one. We went for a little walk up the road, and I said, I'm sorry. I wish this never happened. I wish I could do it all over again. I took all the blame. I said, I love you very much, and I still love your mother. So, and then I never had that talk with the oldest son, David. We had a really good talk. We went to a coffee shop, and he was like, Dad, I'm sorry this had to happen, but if this happening to you is going to, be a benefit to me and the other kids, then I think that's a good thing. And I said, yes, that is. You're right. So we had a really good talk. So then I called Paige, and she said, well, what did you say to the kids? I said, well, just what I told you. And she said, why did you tell them you love me? And I said, because I do. She says, nope, you didn't love me. You thought you loved me. You didn't truly love the real me. You lied to the children. Big problem. Because if daddy still loves mommy, why did mommy leave?
Yeah.
Well, Paige wasn't going to stand for that. There's no way she's going to be the one responsible for this.
Oh,
So
but she
immediately,
can't tell. She can't. Oh, it's tough because no one else can tell you how you think or feel, and that is
right,
kind of at the root of this entire story because no one can or no one no one can or can't tell you whether you are Christian. You
right,
only you truly know that in
right, right,
yourself, in your own heart, in your own mind. You mentioned that it was kind of also reflected upon how you live your life, but in your heart of hearts, you must know how
right,
you feel about your own spirituality.
right,
So it's a lot of people telling other people how they think and feel,
right.
and all of that feels like it's
Yeah.
coming from Uncle Robert. Sorry to interrupt you there. I
No,
just
that's okay. So there's a lot that happened in that March. So again, she leaves mid-January, takes the kids, she comes back. And around this time in mid-March, where she says, you lied to the kids when you told them that you love me, I am about at my lowest point. I'm barely sleeping 1 to 2 hours a night. I wouldn't even, when I went to the doctor, I wouldn't even tell them what was going on. I was so terrified that somebody would find out and would somehow get back to the page. And I told you not to tell anybody. So the doctors would be like, the sleep doctor's like, what's going on? I just can't sleep. Why not? I can't sleep. I wouldn't even tell them. So I've lost 30 pounds. I could barely eat. I could barely work. I can't sleep. I'm miserable. And so then I sit down at the computer and I write this pour my guts out letter just for Uncle Robert. And I feel like, okay, I've gone to bat with him 4 or 5 times at this point. I'm still not a Christian. So they say, Paige and Uncle Robert say, so I'm going to confess every last thing on the face of the earth to this guy. And I write what I put in the book, and I put the whole thing in. Many of the letters and emails from Paige and Uncle Robert, I shortened it so you just didn't get so much in there. I put the whole thing in there. And it's when I read it now, it's absolutely bizarre. It reads like a terrified letter from a cult follower who is petrified that the cult leader is going to either cut him off or do something worse to him, because that's exactly at the time what it was. But what it reads like, or what I thought it was me finally coming clean. Please, Lord, forgive me and accept me as a child of God, as a Christian. And so I sent it to Uncle Robert, who then immediately shares it with Paige, her parents, and my two oldest sons. So
oh
now
gosh.
Paige has the ammunition to say, see, kids, your dad has lied all along. He's never been a Christian. He lied to me when we got married. He lied to me every day of our marriage. He is a liar and a devil. So then Paige shows up about a month later, a couple weeks later. And again, the two boys are still at house with me. And she says, children, I need to speak to Peter. And it's no longer your dad or your father.
Oh
And
gosh.
she delivers what she calls her indictment of me. And she wrote it out. And the indictment was the multiple lies that I had told, because I told the kids I love their mom, and that I was a Christian and was not. And Uncle Robert had, bound Peter in his sin. He is Satan and he's a devil and he's lied to you. And I need to protect you kids from him. So she delivers this. I'm in tears streaming down my face. Every now and then I look at my kids, and my youngest two are probably really confused, but also terrified at this moment. Like, oh my goodness, if my mom is going to treat my dad this way, I am never going to cross my mom, because I don't want to get the same treatment. So I guarantee you all 5 kids were terrified of their mom in that moment. She delivers it. with a certain amount of anger that's hard to describe, the intensity of the emotion and anger she delivered that indictment. Took the 3 younger kids and left. And then Uncle Robert called me shortly after she left, because she probably called him and said, well, I laid it out in front of Peter. He called me, and he never called me. I would always call him. And I was exhausted. I was going to try and go to sleep. And it was a very brief talk. And the crazy thing is, Casey, then in my little notes, I was keeping like a journal, I said that I felt incredibly loved. And I felt that Paige had handled the situation really well. Can you imagine that? I felt loved that Uncle Robert called me after that moment, after being eviscerated by my wife in front of my kids for something that I've not done. So that shows you where I was at. So it's like being held underwater and you're drowning. And the one person who's shoving your head underwater is the one person that you keep turning to help. And that's where I was.
And then thanking them for it as well.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
That insight that you get reading the book through you having those journals, letters, and emails, it's really, really scary stuff, because you as the writer writing about yourself, you say it's the strangest thing to read these back, because it's almost like you don't recognize yourself. So it's not it's kind of like a memoir written after the fact. It's not sort of like in the moment you're describing how you think and feel, and then this happened and then this happened. You're saying when this happened. So it's really bizarre, because I mean, do you remember those moments when you read them back in the journal?
Yeah.
That's so strange.
It is. It's like a different person wrote all that. And I'm glad that so much of it is in writing. So it's not Peter's not telling the truth. I have got, folders of letters and emails from Uncle Robert and Paige. And they were so confident in that they had the truth that they would just write all this bizarre stuff down and send it to me. Like, never a thought like, this is crazy. No, we're right. Everybody else, we are throwing our pearls before the swine. We're right. You're swine. Get over it. We're going to write all this down. And then I kept my notes. And in some of my notes, I remember, Uncle Robert saying that, in order to be free, in order to have happiness, you need to suffer. He literally said that. And I needed to have the crushing to continue. A word about crushing. The idea of crushing was one that Uncle Robert loved. So when it came to our children, I do believe, biblically, that you need to discipline children. Like, parents either discipline children when they're young, or a guy in a blue outfit with a nightstick and handcuffs will discipline you when you're in your 20s. And that's no fun. So you need to learn early, and you try and discipline children, but you do it patiently and you love them. But Uncle Robert's idea, which was 100% adopted by Paige and her parents, was you needed to crush the will of the child. You needed to literally crush the will of the child, crush the child. And he would use that word crush. And then once you have crushed the child, that the child then can obey the parents. And then if he learns to obey his parents, he can learn to obey God, right? Well, I don't recall anybody being crushed in the Bible. I don't recall Jesus Christ crushing anybody. Yes, we need to repent of our sins, but Christ is the one who died for the cross on us. Thank God, God doesn't crush us. But Uncle Robert said we had to crush the children. Now, again, not physically, but theoretically or metaphorically, we had to crush the children. So that crushing was also applied to Paige's parents when they discovered, thanks to Uncle Robert, that they weren't saved. Briefly to Paige when, in the dream, you're the tiger, Paige, you're not saved. And then it really became an art form with me about 20 years later. I mean, this guy was crushing me on a daily basis. You need to suffer in order to be happy. In this heavenly court of law, Paige is the prosecutor and she is shredding you, and you have no evidence to defend yourself. I believe Paige. This is literally stuff that he's telling me, and I wrote all this down. And I'm writing it down so I can remember it, because, I got to remember this. He's right. I'm wrong. Paige is crushing me in this celestial court of law, and I have no evidence to back it up. Well, please give me the evidence so I can finally do it right and thus be saved. And I would take notes of all these conversations. And so this idea that must be crushed in order then to obey, flies in the face of Christianity, number one. I mean, it's totally antithetical to Christian thought and what's written in the Bible. But most importantly, it is what I believe is indicative of or is present in all kinds of cult leaders. And that is where they act as a gatekeeper to whatever faith you believe in. They are the gatekeeper to God. You have to go through this person to be saved. In essence, he's going to save you. Again, that is 180 degrees in the exact opposite direction at 1,000,000 miles an hour from what the Bible says. And I don't know why I couldn't see it in that moment, but I didn't. I see it now.
After going through a period of desperation, loneliness, of really not being able to take care of yourself, you do begin to slowly reach out to people and begin saying, first of all, that you and Paige are separated, and then bit by bit why that is. And then eventually you really do kind of go in the opposite direction and start to realize that the best thing you can do is get your children removed from that situation. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through that part of your experience.
It really took me, Casey, about a year to unravel all the brainwashing and really be healthy mentally again. It took about a year, which again, so when I think about it, I'm kind of just jumping ahead. When I think about if Paige were ever to be rescued from this, it's all she's ever known her whole life. How difficult will it be on her? Because really, in the end, she is a victim, despite all the things that she's said and done, which are horrible. She's a victim. She has been dominated by this guy her whole life. I was only dominated by him for, intensely for a few years, but, off and on for about 2 decades. So it took about a year for that to happen. And again, my family saw immediately, probably, that the children were in danger. It took me a long time. But when I finally did see it, we involved what's called a guardian ad litem, that in high conflict divorce situations, because by this point, Paige had filed for divorce. I'd hope she didn't. Tried to convince her not to, but she did anyway. And so she didn't want anything to do with the guardian ad litem. She just wanted Uncle Robert to be the negotiator for all this. But we got the guardian ad litem, and I had, friends and lawyers, counselors that almost intervened without my approval to say, Peter, I almost called Child Protective Services, months prior because of all the emails I was shipping. They were that bad. So when we finally got the guardian ad litem, again, it was obvious to her within 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And I finally realized everybody's right. My family's right. This is unhealthy. And so there was the one moment that I really knew, and I knew before this moment, sorry, but I think back on it now, and it really drove home the point. And again, I had known for a couple of months how bad it was, but this one moment, the guardian ad litem had gone up to Northern Idaho to meet with Paige and her parents to see where all the kids were living. Now, at this point, the 2 older boys who had spent about a year with me moved out, wouldn't even tell me where they were going because I was the devil. I was the devil with no soul. And they were worried about my criminal behavior, which was none, but they thought I was the devil and criminal in nature. And so they were going to protect themselves. So with the help of Paige and her parents, they moved out. I didn't even know where they were living. So the 3 younger ones are still up in Northern Idaho with Paige and her parents. And the guardian ad litem goes up there to interview them. And Uncle Robert is going to make a special trip up there to meet with you. And I remember telling my attorney I was a little nervous because Uncle Robert, well, crazy, is very charismatic. And I was worried that he would convince her. And he said, Peter, trust me, it's the best thing that could ever happen for you. And boy, was he right. So at that meeting, which I wasn't there, I wish I could have been there. Boy, they all went off on me. And I think the 2 older boys had driven up there to be there as well. So everybody's there but me. I'm the devil. And literally, when they say this, they think I am a devil, an alien, non-human, always lie, et cetera, et cetera. And the kids are there and they hear all this. So the guardian ad litem would have been there like Wednesday, Thursday. On a Friday, at this point, I'm getting to see the kids every other weekend. Paige and I would meet somewhere in between where we live. do the handoff, and I'd get the kids. So I get the kids in Butte, and I could see when I first walk into the Starbucks coffee shop, Paige has got a look on her forehead that could boil an egg. The kids are stern. Nobody said hi to me. No one's looking at me. We get in the car and we drive. And on our way from Butte to where I live, we go through the town of Whitehall, which is where that last church was that we went to, which I love those folks, but Paige and everybody else hated them. So in the car, the younger kids started to hold their breath. And I knew why they were doing it. And I said, why are you doing that? And they were holding their breath because everything that they had learned about the folks in Whitehall from that church in Whitehall was that these people were evil and wicked and so odious that the town of Whitehall, the air was so polluted, they were going to hold their breath when they drove through. That's why they were holding their breath. I knew this, but I wanted to hear them say it. And again, I can't blame them because this is what all the adults were telling them to believe. Well, then one of the children said she didn't like my question and just went off on me for like the next 15 minutes. I was a devil. I was a liar. I'd never done anything. For anybody else, I mean, it was bad. It was 15 minutes worth of just regurgitating this poison that she had been injected in. It went from Uncle Robert to Paige to my children. And I saw it there in that car, 15 minutes worth. And it was this poison that was eating this child up. And it's abusive to have this child try and hold this in. And so she got it out. And all three of them were like, we're in agreement. Dad, if I were a devil, I'd want someone to tell me, was what one of them said. And we were silent for the rest of the drive. We got home and we had a snack and we maybe played cards and played games. And the kids went to bed and I laid down in bed and I told them a good night story. And they went to bed and thought nothing of it. And then I immediately emailed the Garden ad Litem. I said, you have to know this. And I knew then that this was abusive and those kids needed to be out of that situation. And the court agreed and the kids were with me 2 weeks later.
It's not often that the father is granted full custody of all the children. So it must have paid off to have your journals, your emails, your communications. Is this how you were able to go through that process successfully?
I think so. I look back and I marvel, and I've had this discussions with many people. I marvel at the things that Paige and Robert, Uncle Robert, said, knowing they were being evaluated and watched, knowing full well that people are listening, the Garden ad Litem and attorneys, to everything that they are saying and doing. And yet they still wrote these letters and emails. And Robert, in that meeting with the Garden ad Litem, said, Paige is a perfect mother. And you will make a mistake if you, do anything to take these kids away from her. And Peter's, awful. And yet they still said all this. And I remember being at the time stunned by how quickly everybody else saw it. But of course, now it's obvious because it's obvious within 5 minutes. But for me, I was still coming out of this. Wow, how does everybody see this so quickly? Well, duh. Because it's so egregious and so over the top. Everybody recognized it.
Yeah.
Within minutes.
But she's also the mother of your children, and the Paige that you met and fell in love with is not the Paige that exists today. So it must be really tough to confirm to yourself or to admit to yourself that your wife, the mother of your children, is abusing your children.
Yeah, it was very hard because I had spent so many years believing that, she and Uncle Robert had all the answers. I was always wrong. She was always right. She was a wonderful mother. But then to continue to read these letters and these emails and to piece everything together, I could not come to any other conclusion but that because of Uncle Robert, these kids had to be rescued from that situation.
Do you have any idea of what Paige's reaction was during the custody hearing, the outcome of the hearing?
So what happened was that, this was during the divorce process, which I never wanted. I never wanted. I tried to delay it as long as I could. And but before we were going to go anywhere, we had to get this guardian ad litem report, and the report was 50 pages, jaw dropping. And then we asked the judge to adopt it as the interim parenting plan, and she did. And so then we got the kids. Well, I got the kids, and they came to live with me. And then, I'm always a little hesitant to think that this was all coordinated, but it's hard not to look back, because then the two older boys, who at the time had been very, very vicious towards me, called to say they apologize, and I do believe they were sincere. Paige's parents, and so I'd had the kids maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks at this point, and I think maybe they all kind of saw the writing on the wall. So Paige's parents wrote an email of apology. Uncle Robert wrote an email of apology, which was not much of an apology. So everybody kind of thought, oh, this is not good. Let's backtrack here. And then Paige came in unannounced and met with me, the day before we were supposed to go to negotiate. And it was, I had many emotions during that moment. She showed up unannounced. I was waiting to meet with my lawyer. I was at my office. We went into the conference room. She had a sheet of a couple of pieces of paper that she wanted to agree on for a parenting plan where the kids would go back and forth. And she denied everything. She denied the cult and then Uncle Robert and propriety, everything. And it was sad because I just thought, I still loved her at the time, but she didn't see it. It was really clear to me then that, she needs help. And I tried to gently point that out. That was in July of 2018. And she just said, no, I was dead wrong. Uncle Robert was now a godfather, tried to normalize things. And she just didn't see any of it. And it was so sad. And then after being with me a couple months, all three of the younger children, they saw I'm not perfect, but I'm not the devil. And so they're doing much better.
Has there been any support that you've had to seek out to help your children understand what they have experienced?
Yeah. So a lot of counseling. And I have tried to share with them a couple things: that their dad loves them, their mother loves them, and the Lord loves them. And that I have tried to teach them about the unmerited grace of God, and focus on that. The unmerited grace, the forgiveness that God gives us, which was not emphasized for a long time in their lives. I love them. Their mother loves them. And the situation they were in was not healthy. They see that. They are fully aware of all the damage done by Uncle Robert. Nobody calls him that anymore. And then I also tried my best to make sure that what's the right word? We're immersed in church and family. So the young family are spread around the country, but we make sure that we go visit them Christmas or other times in the summer. And we're with aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents, and nobody's perfect. And there's probably a lot of theological differences, but we love each other because we're family. And then we go to a church, and I've had discussions with the pastor of my church, and he knows I'm a preterist, and he doesn't believe it. It's okay. We can have these good discussions, and we still go there. And nobody there is perfect. And yet, this is what fellowship and family and life is all about. And they get it now.
It's quite incredible, really, that you were able to stay so strong in your faith when you were subjected to such horrific spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
I think that there are probably people listening that have had similar experiences and have maybe divorced from their faith or questioned their faith, and others who are holding on to it but not sure what a healthy representation of Christianity really is. So it's inspiring to hear you speak about being able to hold on to that despite Uncle Robert's toxic and malicious influences and skewed doctrine and teachings. Uncle Robert, is he still alive? He must be getting on now.
It's funny because when I go and have discussions with people about this topic, one I will invariably get is, how old is Uncle Robert? So I don't know. He's in his late 70s. I have always maintained that if there is any change with Paige or her parents, where they have rejected him and seen the light, I'll know immediately. And then maybe I would find out when he dies, when he does leave this earth. I don't know. I don't know anything about him really at this point. I don't have any communication with him or Paige's parents, and I have hardly any with Paige at all, which is sad. It's very just little cryptic emails online about the kids. There's nothing else. There's no other communication. And Casey, when your point about my faith, throughout all of those dark times, and really they were dark. I can remember walking and walking and walking. This big tall guy, and it's this Montana winter. I've got my big charcoal gray trench coat, and I've got my yellow legal pad of notes from my phone calls with Uncle Robert and my Bible tucked underneath my arm. And I would walk for hours because I couldn't sit still. And I'm suffering. I'm terrified. I'm confused and afraid. And yet the incredible dichotomy, maybe is not the right word, but contradiction was, on the one hand, I'm still trying to figure out how to be saved. On the other hand, I know that I love the Lord and that I believe. And there's no way I would have gotten through that time without my faith. And I'm praying. It's like, well, I'm constantly praying, and I'm asking the Lord to get me through this. And I'm up in the middle of the night. I can't sleep. I get my Bible out. I'm reading the Psalms, and I'm reading, David in the Psalms, who was on the run, right? The king is after him. Saul's trying to kill him. And so he's crying out to the Lord over and over again. This is in the Bible, right? And here, Uncle Robert and Paige and her parents are like, Peter, get over it. Like, why are you sad? Come
Oh,
on.
yeah.
This is not a Christian response. And I'm like, look at David in the Psalms. And so this is what I was doing. So on the one hand, I knew. On the other hand, I had been convinced that I had just entered this sick realm where I was still missing something. And Uncle
Yeah.
Robert had the key. And he didn't have the key. There was no key. It was a lie.
It's thought terminating cliche, isn't it? That's not the Christian way. That's not the Christian response. It's just like, oh, okay, then I guess I'll just stop doing it. It's so nefarious. And I do wonder if losing a marriage, losing 5 children, losing brothers, sisters, family members, if all of these things are not enough to separate, well, that's not even, that kind of sounds like victim blaming, which it shouldn't do. If all of these things that have happened and Uncle Robert's hold over Paige is still so strong, I do wonder if inevitably, if she is ever able to wake up, it will be once that man has died. So I guess now there'll be people just waiting to see what happens with that situation.
I've had other people say the same thing or wonder the same thing. It's crossed my mind as well. I don't have an answer. I don't know. I do still feel like, despite everything that's happened, um, that she's still a victim.
Yeah.
And I would love for one day to see her come out of it. I don't know what it would look like because this is the only life she's ever known. It'd be probably very difficult. But she deserves to be able to experience life, out from underneath his thumb.
So The Blue Team was your first publication, and
Mhm.
this memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger, is your recent publication. It's an incredibly well-written book. It goes through all experiences and emotions. It's a roller coaster, but it's so insightful. It's like a religious cult, but more of a family cult. And it really shows how environments can exist around us that we might not ever see or not ever know about, and they are there. And there are individuals that have such influence over small pockets of people in ways that we can never imagine. You, with experience in broadcasting and being such a wonderful storyteller, will you narrate your own book and release it as an
Mhm.
audiobook? That would be great.
I would love to do that, and I need to do more research on it. I've heard that it's fairly expensive, but I just launched my book not too long ago, so just trying to get through this whole process of get it out there, get it marketed. I would actually love to do the narration because I love audiobooks. It's fun to do, and I kind of miss those broadcasting days, so that it would be kind of fun to do that. Yeah.
I think that would be wonderful. I can hear it now. And I imagine as well that there would be emotional responses from you reading your book that we might not get if somebody else was to narrate your book as well. So that would be really wonderful. I hope one day that we can announce to the listeners that there is an audiobook available as well.
Yep.
So could you please just tell everybody where they can find you, your work, and your books?
Sure. So, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger is available on Amazon, as is my first novel. It's called The Blue Team. You could also find me at my website at authorpeteryoung.com. I do send out, occasional email newsletters. I am working on the sequel to The Blue Team. So that will hopefully come out in 2024, and there are some common themes that will certainly continue, and it'll kind of dip into the well of experience of Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. So I'm excited about the sequel. I don't have the title written yet, but I hope to have it out in 2024.
That's exciting. You're keeping yourself busy, you're
Yep.
continuing with writing. That's absolutely wonderful. You mentioned before we started recording that you are home with some of your kids.
Yep. Yep.
It's really it's a story with lots of dark moments and lots of heartbreak and lots of anger and lots of coercive control. But ultimately, it is a story that ends rather happily in
Mhm.
comparison to how it could have ended if you didn't pursue legal support and action. So it's so wonderful to know that the legal system in that way worked in the way that it's supposed to,
Right.
because I know that there are a lot of fathers that struggle with getting courts to recognize that the children would be better off and safer with the father as opposed to the mother. There's a big social conversation around that, isn't there? Around sort of
There is. Yeah.
equality, inequality, but it's I was worried about how the book was going to end and felt some peace for you knowing that you were ending that book with the children being with you where they would be safe. And I really truly do hope that Paige gets support and help, and especially if she begins to realize what you began to realize and has some people around her to support her through that journey, because
Yeah.
I can't even begin to imagine what that would even look like, how that
Yeah.
would even happen. So just thank you so much for your
Thank
time,
you.
Peter. Thank you for your book. Thank you for sending me a copy of it. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it from start to end, and just having the journal segments in there, and just little insights into those things. It was a really special book, really well written. So I do recommend that the listeners go and grab themselves a copy. I'll put links in the episode description. And all that's left for me to say is just I appreciate you and your time, Peter, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. And yeah, I appreciate it very much. It was a great time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye bye.